Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Karen Nershi. I'm an assistant professor of cybersecurity here at MIS, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jacqueline Schneider, who is a Hoover Fellow and Director of the Wargaming and Crisis Simulation Initiative. Her research focuses on the intersection of technology, national security, and political psychology, with a special interest in cybersecurity, autonomous technologies, war games, and Northeast Asia. Her scholarly work has been published in journals such as International Organization, Security Studies, and the Journal of Conflict Resolution, as well as her policy work, for which she's been a frequent contributor to outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, CNN, NPR, the BBC, and MSNBC. Dr. Schneider is an active member of the defense policy community with previous positions advising the Cyberspace Solarium Commission at the Center for New American Security and the RAND Corporation. And before beginning her academic career, she spent 6 years as an Air Force officer in South Korea and Japan, and is currently a reservist assigned to U.S. Space Systems Command. So we're very lucky to have her joining us today to discuss her new book, The Hand Behind Unmanned, Origins of the U.S. Autonomous Military Arsenal. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Schneider. Thank you.
Thank you. And it really is a joy to be here. And with this is such a special program in the security world because you guys really build the next generation of foreign policy and practitioners. So this is a book for practitioners, about the bureaucratics of how and why we do things. So I appreciate being here. So the book itself is the product of a collaboration with Julie McDonald that goes back all the way to 2013. And in 2013, we were doing a analysis of preferences for manned versus unmanned. And if those of you who remember that time period, we were like heavily into coin. We were knee deep in the global war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the Predators and the Reapers were extraordinarily popular with previously the Bush administration and absolutely with the Obama administration. But we were realizing that there was potentially a disconnect between this kind of foreign policy tool of choice and the perceptions of the actual tool on the battlefield. So we did a bunch of survey experiments and interviews of combat controllers and JTACs, the folks that call in the airstrikes on the battlefield. So they're sitting on the battlefield deciding what kind of air power they want to support them. And overwhelmingly, they preferred manned in situations that had a potential danger of fratricide. And over and over and over again, they would say this. And we're in this room, and they're talking about it. And then one Marine holds up his hand, and he said, "Guys, it doesn't matter what we think. These are inevitable." Oh, that's so interesting. Here, these people really, you would think they would have the most agency over the weapons that they're choosing, and yet they think that there is this hand that is guiding the weapons that they're going to buy. So that started really the project. And the idea behind the project is to put human faces and ideas on the kind of the non-rational behind a story that sometimes gives way more agency to technology and way less agency to humans. So that was the genesis of the book. I like to start with this quote. This is, we've just won a war with a lot of heroes flying around in planes. The next war may be fought with airplanes with no men in them at all. Take everything you've learned about aviation and war and throw it out of the window, and let's go to work on tomorrow's aviation. It'll be different from anything the world has ever seen. Anyone want to guess who said that? Or when they said it?
Was that?
Yeah.
Way back.
Okay. Oh man, y'all ruining it. This is Hap Arnold, right? This is 1945. This is the U.S. Army Air Force. And the reason why I like to start with this is because not only does it kind of throw a wrench in the whole narrative that pilots are the ones that keep us from adopting unmanned air systems, but also it shows that this quest to remove the human from the battlefield and give range away from the violence of conflict is not a new or novel concept. Instead, it's something that we've been fundamentally trying to do for a very long time. So what are the three what are some big questions that motivated the book? The first is, so why did the U.S. invest in an unmanned arsenal that's dominated by, Global Hawk, Predator, Reaper, these systems that are expensive and exquisite and remotely piloted, right? So they're very controlled assets. And then I think secondarily, and the Hap Arnold quote kind of alludes to this, why did the Air Force, a service of pilots, end up being the lead in that investment in unmanned technology? And then I think more pragmatically, what does this book and this analysis say about kind of how the US has responded to the Ukraine conflict and whether we had the kinds of systems in our arsenal that Ukraine and to some extent Israel are now showing are dominant on a modern battlefield? So since this is like kind of an IR world, so my background, I was a Charlie Glazer student. Charlie Glazer is a realist. Charlie Glazer loves rational politics. But I also had on my dissertation committee Marty Finnemore, who is a constructivist. And so I think Julie and I
my
both.
classmate, by the way.
Was she really?
Yeah.
Was she as lovely then as she is now?
Always, yes.
So I approach hard security questions always with this eye of, I wouldn't call myself a constructivist, but someone who's really interested in the ideas, the organizations, the entanglement, the way in which variables are endogenous. So what you're going to hear in the next 25 minutes is not a clear causal story. Instead, it's a story of endogeneity, of the way in which organizations and processes and people elide to create these very rational security decisions. So this is a quote from Donald McKenzie, who I think is some of the best work on kind of science and technology. It says, the world is not the product of technology developing autonomously, so a good word for me. It is not brought about by benignly rational decision-making, but by mundane social processes. And that is the story of this book. So what's the argument in a nutshell? Buying weapons is not strictly rational. When organizations are looking at the weapons that they need to invest in, they're making these decisions in a world of uncertainty. There's uncertainty about the context in which these weapons will be used. There's also uncertainty about how those technologies are going to perform on the battlefield. So absent the certainty in those choices, you have to make decisions about buying weapons based on ideas about the future of war. And the idea is about the way in which you as an individual and the organization that you're a part of is going to play a role in that future war. So faced with that uncertainty, especially about emerging technologies, these individuals and organizations are going to have to rely on something beyond capacity or capability, and that is beliefs and identities. These, we argue, come a priori to capacity. So often in political science, we like to say more GDP equals more military strength. So this is kind of like the Mearsheimer way, my old realist way of proxying military capability. But the argument here is that actually not true, that there's a series of kind of intervening variables that come prior to capacity that actually determine whether those investments lead to military effectiveness or not. And so these ideas and beliefs and identities, they end up interacting with what we call policy entrepreneurs who are propagating different ideas about the future of war. Critical junctures, maybe 9/11, or big budget cycles. And then path dependencies, where you have investments in technologies that have serious lags or that are at the beginning of a budget cycle. And all of these things come together to become budget lines. So what are the beliefs that matter when it comes to the development of the unmanned systems in the American arsenal? Well, I think I've let you go a few slides without putting a definition, so here we go. What do we mean by unmanned? And I think actually what we mean is unhuman, but that is such an awkward turn of phrase that we chose not to use it. There was a little push like, oh, you should use uncrewed. That's the word of the day. Actually, we're not talking just about uncrewed, because uncrewed kind of implies that there's a platform that a crew would be in. But a lot of what we're talking about when we mean unmanned is military systems that have some autonomy to accomplish their mission. So it's not just platforms. Instead, it's a wide range of different capabilities, munitions, missiles, mines, autonomous bombs, satellites, sensors, right? There's a range of different characteristics. I mean, there's an extraordinary heterogeneity of technological characteristics within this kind of broader category of unmanned. Some of them are dumb but automated, and others are fully autonomous. You have some that are used for strike and some that are used for intelligence. And then I think, one of the big trajectory splits that we discuss in the book is this kind of difference between a platform versus a munition versus a system. And so these decisions about these range of different characteristics within this unmanned category is really a trade-off about beliefs about which characteristics of war we think are most important at the time. So some examples, precision, persistence, lethality, mass, speed. No one weapon system can provide all of these characteristics. And so the decision maker, the organization buying the weapons, is having to trade off these different characteristics based about what they think the future of war is going to be. So a lot of the previous discussion about unmanned was a strict dichotomy about manned versus unmanned. And actually, that's not interesting. It's more interesting to understand how these different ideas influence a wide variety of characteristics that unmanned could be optimized for. So in the book, we focus on mostly kind of the end of the Cold War, 9/11 and beyond. But the history of US unmanned goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War. So I'm going to run through really quickly some of these early years, and then most of the kind of following ideas comes from end of Cold War and beyond. So leading up to World War I, you're dominated actually by naval innovations. The first US use of unmanned was the Bushnell mines, where we floated some kegs of powder down a river in the Revolutionary War. They made a song about it. It was like semi-successful. The British were just kind of like dumb, like befuddled, and made some bad choices because of it. But it was really dumb, right? Automation. I don't mean dumb like a dumb strategy. I mean like the weapon is dumb. But you saw actually leading into after the Civil War and in the late 1880s, actually a ton of innovation when it came to torpedoes and naval mines that is happening in the United States, but also in the UK. And so you actually have these big debates about whether you should have torpedo ships. And there comes this conversation about the ethics of using the torpedo, because the torpedo gives this range and the range is really unethical. And I think it's so funny because you could like take these arguments and you could almost like put them on these contemporary systems. But Navy's the primary, or the naval domain is the primary domain of innovation there. They work on unmanned balloons, and there's this thing called the Kettering bug, which is an unmanned aerial system in World War I. But absent the development of radio technology, it's really, really hard to control things in the air. And even a lot of what's happening in the Navy, in the underwater, starts at least with cabling. So moving into the interwar and World War II, you get a ton of experimentation. And once again, Navy appears to be leading it. So there's the image on the top is actually from the Narragansett Bay by the Naval War College, where the Naval War College at the time was working or experimenting with these unmanned surface naval vessels for training, a lot of decoy and baits. Interestingly enough, even though the Navy had been really on the edge for torpedoes and mines, they shelved their torpedo and mine factories. We end up being real slow to that in World War II. We don't really catch up till 1943 and beyond. While in World War II, you have the advent of radars, you have the advent of radio, which allows for control. So here's the first time we actually see the development of unmanned aerial vehicles in war. And the picture on the bottom, which is a little bit cut off, is a pretty disastrous experiment we had called Operation Aphrodite, where you would basically have these unmanned fighter jets underneath a bomber jet, and they're kind of set up like kamikazes. The problem is, if you just release them from the bomber, they don't know where they're going, right? There's no guidance. And so they would have a man come down from the bomber, fly it, right, so that there was a trajectory for it to intercept with the target, and then parachute out. It didn't work very well, and that's actually how John F. Kennedy's oldest brother died. So we can blame unmanned systems for that. But late in the war, you start seeing the development of long-range rockets, mostly in the German inventory, and that will define the Cold War. So the Cold War, our unmanned investments is really a focus on nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. But this wasn't necessarily going to happen. There was a bit of a decision here between cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. And initially for the Air Force, they liked cruise missiles more because they looked a lot like aircraft, and so you could justify that like this was the Air Force's thing and not the Army's thing. But they quickly realized that this was not going to help them with what their real mission was, which was strategic bombing, right? So they end up adopting nuclear armed ballistic missiles, even though they don't have a pilot in them, because it helps people like LeMay justify the Air Force's dominance in this kind of strategic attack, strategic bombing kind of role. Navy has a slightly different path towards ballistic missiles. So Navy actually preferred cruise missiles because ballistic missiles are, especially as they were initially developed, the type of fuel they were using were inherently dangerous for carriers. So they had a project with the Army, and they tried to shoot a ballistic missile off a docked carrier, right? Like it was an experiment. The carrier completely blew up. So the Navy was like, yeah, we're done with that. We'll focus on cruise missiles. But Rickover comes in, and Rickover is a submarine officer who's really interested in developing nuclear-powered submarines. But submarines don't have a really prominent mission in the Cold War Navy at the time. We're not going after other Navy submarines in a big way. So he advocates for a new type of fueling for ballistic missiles, and those ballistic missiles become part and parcel of the strategic submarine mission that becomes a huge part of the Cold War Navy. Interestingly enough, space we were a little late getting into the space race, but when Sputnik happened, this spurs both kind of Schriever in the Air Force with ballistic missiles, it spurs Rickover. So you also have space development. So focus is really on strategic here. You see less experimentation and innovation in tactical unmanned. Torpedo and mine development completely stagnates, and everyone's kind of in, kind of not on nuclear cruise missiles, and you really don't see a lot of the unmanned aerial systems at all. Moving into Vietnam, you actually start seeing a lot of experimentation in the tactical side. So war has a tendency to do this, right? A tendency to refocus our priorities to the battlefield and tactical innovation. So you get unmanned aerial vehicles for baits, for battle reconnaissance, you get the harm and other guided munitions. And at the same time, there's like this big context in which the arms control agreements are limiting developments for ballistic missiles, but it also allows people like Kissinger to kind of play it both ways with cruise missiles. So we see that as ballistic missiles are kind of stagnating, or at least, we're not developing them in the same rate that we were earlier in the Cold War. Now you have cruise missiles and they're conventional cruise missiles, which is a really, really big shift for the US. We really were not thinking of conventional capabilities here, but that happens Vietnam and the end of Cold War. Moving into the end of the Cold War, we get the focus on the Powell Doctrine. You see a decrease in military budgets, so a rise in cruise missiles, space-based navigation, investments in precision strike. But it's after 9/11 that unmanned aerial systems become extremely important to the US arsenal, as well as a proliferation of space-based support. While all the kind of big ballistic missiles that we had focused on in the Cold War, those tend to stagnate. And interestingly, so also does conventional strike stagnate. Even cruise missiles, you kind of get block munition upgrades, but you're not getting the same kind of focus and innovation as other periods. So this is the what. This would be like my dependent variable in my political sciencey terms. So let's talk about the why. Why in those last two columns do we see that innovation? So this is a quote from Frank Kendall, and it alludes to what I would consider in my political science terms to be the null hypothesis of the book, which is that, absent everything else, the status quo variable that explains all weapons acquisition is service identity. And here, I want to highlight and rely on the work of Carl Bilder, which is actually a 1980s book, which I find remarkably prescient and still applicable. And Bilder argues that each of the services have a core identity, which he calls a mask, and that their investment in technology and the way they develop different force organizations and think about fighting wars is really based on what their identity is. So the Army is the service of the person, the individual, the citizenry. There's a real focus on the ground and the infantry and the individual. They're less likely to adopt technology earlier. The Navy is a traditional survey. It is a traditional service, one of the most traditional services in the military. It cleaves, it is the least joint of all of our services because they do everything. And so what ends up happening is they're defined less by their competition with other services and more by competition within themselves. So the submariners, the surface warfare officers, the aircraft pilots, what they buy is based on this kind of bureaucratic infighting inside the Navy. The Air Force, as the newest service, is, and full disclosure, I am still an Air Force officer, so everything bad I say, I take on myself. Air Force, it's the newest service, and they, are somewhat, they are keen to make sure that they are retaining missions, capabilities, authorities. Because of that, they are willing to adopt technology that may be somewhat adjacent to their core identity in order to make sure that the Army and the Navy do not get it. And so because of that, you see that while they are all about strategic air power and the magic of flight, that they are willing to kind of take weapons and bend them towards strategic air power in order to make sure that they don't become core missions for the Army or the Navy. So I was talking about this with my 12-year-old. I'm like trying to explain it in her kind of tween vocabulary. And I was like, okay, so the Air Force is giving like main character energy. And so I think I want to highlight a few of my favorite Air Force stories before we move on. There's this quote from Theodore von Karman. This is right after World War II. There were like 37 different missile programs at the time, or maybe it was like 50. It was a lot of missile programs. They had to whittle it down by a giant amount. And so the Air Force had to figure out what their argument was for keeping as many of the rocket programs as they could and not letting the Army have it. And so Theodore von Karman, who is a rocket engineer, says, we use the term pilotless aircraft to cover all types of missiles so as to prevent the project from falling into the hands of the Army. And so this is a really good example of the Air Force willing to kind of adopt a technology that they maybe wouldn't have been their primary love just to make sure the Army doesn't get it. And then there's another example where they're having a fight with the Navy. So during the Carter administration, there was a big debate about whether to invest in the B-1 or to invest in cruise missiles. And there was actually an argument made that you could just have cruise missiles and not the B-1. The Air Force was really unhappy about this. The Air Force loved the B-1. And they were sabotaging the cruise missile development. So their report to Congress was, hey, this is only good as a decoy. It's never going to have enough technology to have enough guidance to be useful as a cruise missile. Let's just do the B-1. I think that's the best option. But the Navy had also been developing a cruise missile and pretty successfully. And so Congress said, I hear you, Air Force, but sounds like Navy can do it. And so this Air Force general came back from the congressional hearing and said, we better get serious about the outcome unless we want a torpedo rammed up its bomb bay. So, it's a really good example, once again, of how the competition between the services really defines their willingness to adopt different technologies. So in general, what do these service identities lean to in terms of different choices? One, systems that support service identity. So Air Force, in general, bombers and fighters. Navy, carriers, submarines. Army, tanks. So what does that mean? That means you're biased towards platforms over munitions. If a munition threatens a platform, they don't want the munition. And quite often, even munitions that had technological promise were abandoned by the services if they felt like it couldn't be carried on aircraft that were on the aircraft carrier or couldn't be put in the submarine bays. So there's a real tendency to focus on the platform. And then I think in general, there's a power of these different warfare communities. So, the surface warfare officers versus the submarine warfare officers, the pilots, these operational communities have a lot of power in determining which technologies are adopted. Surface identity, null hypothesis. But surface identities don't have in themselves an inherent belief about the future of war. So where do those beliefs about the future of war come from? And we identified two beliefs that we argue define the last 30 years of acquisition. And one of those beliefs, I think, is nicely summed up here in the 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review. The ongoing revolution in military affairs could change the conduct of military operations. Technologies for sensors, information processing, precision guidance, and many other areas are rapidly advancing. For the United States, the revolution in military affairs holds the potential to confer enormous advantages and to extend the current period of U.S. military superiority. So we identify this idea about revolutions in military affairs, a bit of a technological determinism, an idea that was started by, this is a fun little pointer, Andy Marshall, the bald guy on the picture. He is a career bureaucrat and has a tiny office in the bowels of the Pentagon. And yet, the ideas that come out of his office end up having this extraordinary influence on the defense budgets for the next 30, 40 years, kind of up into today. So Andy Marshall in the late 70s and early 80s, he's watching the precision-guided munition revolution that's occurring. He's in Israel, and he starts reading some of these, or has people translate some of these Soviet writings, which are very Marxist, but they call it military technological revolution, where they are arguing that technology has this kind of capacity to create these large increases in military effectiveness. And he says, I think they're onto something, right? So he reframes it so it's kind of less Marxist, right? It's revolutions in military affairs. But he has this extraordinary cadre of thinkers that are working for him. This is the Elliot Cohens, the Andrew Krapinovich, the Tom Menkins, actually the list is so long I could probably not list them all here, the Bob Work, Mike Vickers. He has this group of people, and he starts commissioning work, policy work that comes out of CSBA, these people like Elliot Cohen and others are staffing the Quadrennial Defense Review. He is commissioning books on military revolutions that are being taught in professional military education. So this idea of revolutions in military affairs becomes a really dominant belief about what the American way of war, especially after the Cold War, is and should be. And what does this mean for unmanned technology? The focus here is on how technology can create range, how it can create situational awareness, and how it can create very quick and decisive engagement. So unmanned systems here, he's not really loyal to any particular platform, but this idea suggests that unmanned systems can create that kind of fast and situational awareness, and it's all about speed, right? At the same time, there's another belief that's happening. So this belief, it's not like organic, it's created and it's proliferated, and it has a policy entrepreneur that makes sure that it's adopted, and actually in a really savvy, amazing way. But on contrast, there's something else that's happening. So, at this time period, you have officers leading who basically were lieutenants and captains in Vietnam, and they've watched the US lose a very painful war, where one of the lessons they have taken is that if you lose people on the battlefield, you also lose public support. And when you lose public support, you lose the war. And so you get a real narrative, especially after the Cold War, on force protection and kind of a belief in casualty aversion. And so at the same time that we're advocating for these technologies that are increase situational awareness and give speed and range, we're also saying, that's great, and we're also going to do that by losing less pilots. And so there's this eliding of these different beliefs that's occurring, where the force protection is also leading people to invest in unmanned systems that primarily protect the pilot or protect the human from the danger, from the dangers of war. Now, That's what I would consider an organic belief. So that belief, you look at, there's Colin Powell down there, these are beliefs that people learn. They're not, he didn't commission somebody to write the wisdom of this. It was something that was ingrained. It was something, if you read through, if you download the documents that were written in PME in the 90s and 2000s, you'd be shocked how much we were using the word force protection. It was actually a key tenet of what military effectiveness was. It's kind of disappeared actually from the vocabulary. But these two dominant beliefs become really, really important. So you have policy entrepreneurs like Andy Marshall, like Colin Powell, but you also have policy entrepreneurs within the services, Schriever, Rickover, and then some from kind of outside the military who are pushing or supporting the ideas that are becoming the dominant ideas about the future of war. Now, all of this is happening in the context of domestic and international politics. So you have this push and pull. You have war, which becomes the arbitrator of, in all cases, of technological adoption. And it generally creates a focus on tactical over strategic. You have people like John McCain and Ronald Reagan and Bob Gates. You have these civilians, kind of like the Posen civilian, oversight. You have these civilians that are saying, no, we can't buy that, or yes, we should buy that, or they're influencing the budget. And then you have critical junctures. You have moments in time that become so important to the path dependency of weapons that it is impossible to explain our current acquisition choices without understanding the decisions made. And I think one of those is this really eye chart in the middle, which you can't really read, doesn't matter. That's a depiction of airland battle in Core 86, which is the acquisition program. So this happens in Goldwater, right after Goldwater Nichols. The Air Force and the Army are forced to be BFFs, and they have to work with each other in order to develop technology. And at the same time, the Army has new all-volunteer force. It has a new doctrine. And Reagan, there's also this increased budget, right? So you're investing in lots of technology. So the technologies that they invest in at that particular time period end up being the last major budget infusion for 10, 15 years. And then when we do get another big budget infusion, it's for coin. And counterinsurgency. So many of the technologies that we're giving to the Ukrainians at the beginning of the war are technologies that came from that eye chart right there. The Patriot, the Havillands, the Stingers, they don't speak specifically about a unmanned system, but there is definitely a focus on missiles that support the ground component. So all to say, super complicated. What does all this mean for emerging technologies? Cyber is an interesting one because based on everything I just said, it should be a hard case. It's joint, it's virtual, it's system, but it's actually had some relative success. And I think here it shows the power of narratives and policy entrepreneurs. First Alexander, and then Admiral Rogers, and then Nakasone. And I think here also you have the role of Congress and the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, who have been protecting and funding a joint capability that is not a preferred service capability.
Shows Nakasone sat in your chair when he came here a year and a half ago.
Did he describe himself as a policy entrepreneur?
I think so. He also owned the room. He just took over and he'd be like, yeah. And then he'd get bored. He'd be like, no, you. He directed the room for an hour. It was incredible. It was the most four-star performance I've ever seen.
Well, his ability to, really, cyber is such a bad case for acquisition and for this is just an example of technologies that should just die on especially the cyber national mission forces that are at the joint level. That is something that should have failed. But I think in many ways due to his personality, and then he had some big, important supporters in Congress that really led to it. You don't have somebody like Nakasone for JADC2, or in general, there's no Schriever, Rickover for hey, we need to, get better networks and software. Maybe it'll be Elon. But there has been, no advocate that comes out and is able to shape a story around network investments. When it comes to JADC2, what you basically have are 3 different networks that are being developed by the services, all named something different. Honestly, I can't remember them all. and like, okay, so how are we gonna get all this to work? I mean, my recommendation would be you'd go to the Air Force and say, hey, Air Force, your ABMS isn't working very well, but the Navy's, overmatch or whatever it's called, it's working really well. We'll have to use the Navy's, and then the Air Force will get it together. Space Force is a challenge because they don't have a core identity yet, but in their quest to find one, you can see that there is a natural inclination to focus on space be space. I kill things in space, I defend things in space, versus the way in which space enables conventional capabilities. And that's tied very closely to the propagation of a service identity. So this is something where it would behoove Congress to be very careful with how they develop Space Force to make sure that it doesn't become what we in the military sometimes call a self-licking ice cream cone. Doesn't even really make sense, does it?
It doesn't really, but we use that
But
so
like we
much.
know, like
A couple of those.
yeah. And then I think the final is, and I think is conventional strike. In the last 20, 30 years, while we've been building these big UASs, China, Iran, North Korea, and now, you watch Houthi rebels. Conventional missiles are really important part of modern warfare and part of modern military arsenals. And for a variety of reasons, we have very limited conventional strike capability. And the conventional strike capability we do have is primarily tied to platforms. So it shoots off a plane or it shoots off an aircraft. That's a pretty big limitation, right? Again, especially in comparison to other states that have been developing ground-based cruise missiles or ground-based ballistic missiles. Why is that? And I think the book would suggest that like a huge portion of why that's occurring is because of service identity, but also because the conventional strike ended up being like a periphery to some of these beliefs. So I've talked for too long, I'm sure. But thank you guys. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you. Well, we'll take questions from the audience, and also those of you on Zoom, feel free to raise your hands. We'll take a few questions and then let you answer them, but I'll start with the first question. So I want to ask you a question that probably many of us have been thinking about some version of this question lately. But the book is all about the fact that this technology adoption comes from these existing organizations that have their own culture and ideas. And there are moments of change that might be caused by policy entrepreneurs or other events, but it's not necessarily about, say, the change in an administration. But so we currently have a new administration that seems very bent on changing a lot of things, disrupting a lot of things. So I was just wondering, for your own thinking, how are you thinking about the dichotomy here between continuity of the organizations, their ideas, and the administration, particularly in the context of the military and their technological approaches?
That's a great question. And what has been remarkable in this is there are a few direct pathways to the executive being able to significantly shift the services. And the services' ability to be entrenched in their identity and core interests is remarkable. Actually, there's a great book by Peter Dombrowski and his co-author about strategy, grand strategy, and they actually argue that the Navy, that it's all about the Navy, and it makes an argument that like good luck with
War college faculty, so.
It's with Simon Reich, I think.
Yes, and he makes this argument that like, oh, this idea of grand strategy is nice, but like actually the services just do the services' own idea of strategy, and like grand strategy is like instrumental for them. And I think that is one of the stories that comes out of the book. So where do we see executives make big difference? Well, Bob Gates stepped in and fired the chief of staff of the Air Force and said, you need to buy more unmanned systems. That was a direct correlation. Reagan's influence is kind of more about budgets, right? Like a large infusion of a budget leads more room towards technological innovation. Eisenhower's a great one. Space is a really interesting example here. The reason why we didn't have a space force was Eisenhower watched the services bickering amongst each other and thought the historians are gonna hate me for the way I paraphrase this, but they're gonna really mess up space, and space is really strategic. And so he actually created the National Reconnaissance Organization office in order to make sure that space had a relative kind of stability against service identity. So there are ways in which executives can reach into the Defense Department and change leadership and create organizations. I think the creation of the Space Force, rightly or wrongly, will have a very large impact on the trajectory. But it requires an executive being really kind of in the weeds. So it seems like this executive is probably pretty willing to fire a lot of people, and they've laid out what they think are their core priorities. And so I do think they will significantly shift short-term spending. Whether that affects the longer term spending. The other thing is, one of the things that they put on their list was non-attritable, long-term, long-distance autonomous weapons. I can't remember the actual phrasing, but it sounds like, kind of lower cost cruise missiles or drones for strike, attritable drones. And that sounds great, but what he's gonna have to contend with is now the services are going to have to make a decision about how they organize the force to use those systems. So he can tell them to buy more of them, but if they don't also create units, tactics, campaigns, network capabilities that integrate all of that, they'll just be sitting in a warehouse somewhere and they won't become a key part of American strategy. And, if you have a general that disagrees with a particular kind of decision like that, that is the way to, in the long term, keep it from entering the battlefield.
Interesting, thank you.
So it was fun to get to hear sort of take two on this, because I got the first version of this at the heart. No, it was fun.
Hopefully better.
Well, it was helpful to have slides, and this was a little more structured, but I liked the off-the-cuff way you did it at the Hargroves too. So anyway, it was fun to hear it twice. I have a really basic question, and you alluded to it, but I'd love to hear you talk about it more, which is the kind of military innovation that we're seeing both in the Ukraine war and in Gaza, Israel's war in Gaza. How do you think that that's going to seed these conversations and shape the behavior of these bureaucracies? And how do you think we're going to learn the lessons or respond to the inputs of that? I'd love to hear you talk a little more about that.
And actually, this is a good plug. We're doing a podcast version of the book that's going to be coming out March 26th. And the last episode deals exactly with this question that you just asked. And we've been interviewing a bunch of people who have ideas about the future of war. And actually, we see a dichotomy when it comes to how the influence of these technologies on the future U.S. arsenal. There's a group of people, I think like Mike Horowitz, to some extent, Stacey Pettyjohn, Mike Brown talked about it, this idea of like precision mass, right? The investment in lots and lots of unmanned systems, but with more kind of autonomous capability than previous. So not like a bunch of completely dumb things, but instead things that have some level of autonomy. And that would be an important part of the U.S. arsenal. And then I think you have another group of people who are like, no, like first off, we already bought the expensive manned platforms. Like that continues to exist. And so there's like a high-low mix of the two, and that like real combat will be a combination of what we like to fight, which is long-range expensive strike, with something that looks like unmanned kind of swarms of stuff. My personal take is that the way unmanned systems are being used in Ukraine is to slow down war. And it's basically created like a 20-kilometer dead zone, right, where you can't hide. And that has basically stalemated with a bunch of other factors, but that stalemates a war, especially when people are dug in. So I don't think that's the way US ever likes to buy weapons, to slow war down. And I think at least for the last 30 years, we have been trying to only fight in wars where we can fight wars in only using maneuver, not attrition. And I think this is the fundamental frustration at the ideological level is, do we want to buy a bunch of systems that are really to slow down war if that means that we're not going to fight the maneuver kind of warfare that we really want to fight? And if we can't fight the maneuver warfare we want to fight, should we even go into that conflict? I think there's probably ways that those two can be reconciled. I think bureaucratically, like if you look at the organizational incentives to adopt these different technologies, why have we not invested more in these FPVs and small copters? Those are organic to the ground. And it's going to have to be the Army adopting them. And I think the Air Force in general is not super fan of the Army having a lot of stuff in their space. But the Air Force has also kind of abdicated the casserole by retiring the A-10. The F-35 has a pretty limited CAS capability. Definitely not the kind of not as much of the firepower.
Close air support. So I know there's a lot of acronyms being thrown around.
Yeah, my fault. So the Army should adopt the small copters, but they probably won't. It'll be the Marines. The Marines are always the leader in technological innovation because their identity, I didn't really talk about their identity is the best at any mission. Because of that, it gives them a lot of flexibility to adopt different types of technology in order to be the best at that mission. And they actually were the first ones to invest in UASs. When we flew them in the Gulf War, they were Marine UASs that were being flown. And the other kind of big fight that I see, two other technologies, big fights. Conventional strike. Who's going to take that? We definitely should be doing more of that. More conventional strike. So some of that needs to be like more missiles that shoot from the platforms we have. That I think will be an easy win. The harder thing is we need stuff that doesn't need a platform to be shot from. So who's going to own that? The Army should own it. This should be a long-range strike from the Army. The Army should be fighting for this. And they kind of did a little bit with Christine Wormuth. I'm not sure. The fight seemed to simmer down because Air Force did not like it. Somebody needs to do conventional long-range strike. And then mines. I know we don't like talking about mines in the US, but mines have been a huge part of that war. And naval mines will be in a ginormous part of a Taiwan conflict. And the way technology is developed, there is a way that those can be more ethical, but more importantly, they can be also extraordinarily effective. And the US, I think, doesn't want to think about mines, but it will be a reality in the next war.
I might also, I'm not sure these are questions, Jackie,
Yeah.
sort of half-baked thoughts, but playing off a little bit of your talk, and I had a very similar question to Karen about like, how does all of this apply to the new administration? My instinct is that we should expect a lot of investment in unmanned systems, and so if there's not as much as we expect, then it probably is a bureaucratic, politics story involving service resistance. But there's sort of two other things that sort of didn't totally come up yet that I think also push in that direction, right? And one is kind of part B of your question, which is sort of Elon Musk and Doge. Like, there's this big cost-cutting thing from somebody who's really into like technology and AI and stuff like that. And so especially the Army, I could see a big move to get them to way reduce troops in uniform and replace them with technology as sort of a Doge-led, top-down thing. I'm super sympathetic to arguments about beliefs and identity. I was an Alex George student, so
Yeah, I know. When you said that at the beginning, I was like,
So I'm way on board with that. The other thing that he was really big on was kind of lessons of history. So I totally agree with you about Vietnam in there, but I think the other thing about, this like brief period of, almost obsessive concern about force protection was all the ethnic conflicts of the 1990s and peacekeeping missions and military operations other than war. We should not be having any casualties at all. Let's just find systems we can send in to do this stuff without, boots on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And we talk about that. I mean, that was very interesting. It's funny because I feel like that period is already kind of being forgotten.
Yeah.
But it really the ideas about war were very, very different in that time frame. I want to get to this question about labor reduction with autonomy, because this question came up at CSAC last week as well, and I keep running back to it in my mind. Almost no use of autonomy to decrease as a substitute for human capital. As a substitute for human lives lost, yes, but not for human capital. And one of the fundamentally interesting things about these autonomous technologies is how much tail there is versus tooth. The amount of people that they're having to use to operate the autonomous weapon system. So we were lucky enough to get Michael Kaufman on that podcast that we're working on. So we're talking to him about what's going on in Ukraine. He said, you got to understand, none of this is autonomous. All of these systems are being piloted, right? There are whole units of people behind these technologies. So it is not replacing labor as labor in the market. And there are places where the US military could invest in autonomy that would reduce labor costs, right? Like these are administrative processes, and they have been highly resistant to that kind of technological innovation. I mean, maybe that's somewhere where Elon Musk can help the DoD. I mean, nobody's going to be upset if they have better internet. Or I mean, I know me as a reservist, I got to log on to Internet Explorer in order to log my duty days. It'd be nice, not to have to try and get on Internet Explorer, which is sunsetted.
Halfway through my year in the Pentagon, they outsourced our IT and quality dramatically went down. It was a lot of grumbling.
So, but there haven't been, and I think when we think about one of the limits to the adoption of this autonomous technology is the general inability to invest in the information infrastructure required to actually make autonomous technology effective. So the Army had a very ambitious program, the Future Combat System, in the early 2000s, which ultimately failed pretty miserably and catastrophically. But part of the reason why it failed was that they envisioned a world in which manned and unmanned were working together, kind of like these combat assistance that the Air Force is working on now. And so you would have these manned but lighter armed vehicles, and they would have, unmanned systems that would be their sensors out. And they never built the bandwidth or the network capability. The Army says the technology didn't exist, they couldn't do it. That's probably not exactly true, but they never built the network infrastructure. And, looking at the way we're thinking about buying, if we really are going to increase the amount of autonomous systems in our arsenal, it will only work effectively with those subsequent investments in the non-sexy network infrastructure, which still doesn't have a policy entrepreneur. So that if somebody could come up with a compelling way to talk about how cool networks are.
Okay, so we can take a couple questions. Mr. Rod, you have one?
Sure. I'm Sharat Joshi. I teach in the NPTS program. So you mentioned the Marine Corps, and I'm not absolutely familiar with the debates over the last few years, but I have seen some, mention about some fairly dramatic changes within their strategies, especially, you mentioned Taiwan also, especially in those kinds of scenarios. So I'm wondering to what extent your work, your focus on emerging technologies, to what extent that plays into that particular debate, which was, from an academic perspective, it just seemed quite dramatic in the degree to which there was a split between very senior levels of the leadership of the Marine Corps.
Yeah, I think I mean everything you're saying is absolutely right. It was a pretty revolutionary shift. It was a shift in how they thought about organizing their force, the types of conflicts that they thought their forces would be used in, and the way in which technology would integrate with those, which ultimately led to them creating a force structure that did not optimize on kind of the core missions of the last 30 to 40 years. And that really bothered a lot of Marines. I think, in that new force structure, they are very forward-leaning on kind of the uses of autonomy and other types of emerging technologies with the core Marine unit, which I was, look, I was sympathetic to the efforts they were making. A lot of the decisions they made about what type of people they needed in the Marines were based on the technology that they thought that would be used in those future conflicts. And I think that may have actually been what got them I don't want to jump into this fight, it's a nasty fight. But I think that might have been part of why some of the anti-change group were so upset, was because it seemed to be asking for a different type of Marine who would be operating those types of technology. I mean, in general, I think the Marines are usually more flexible with their relationship with technology. The problem the Marines actually have is that their funding comes through the Navy. So there's always this Navy filter on whatever the Marines want to do. So quite often they're open for experimentation with technology, but there's not like the funding from the Navy. So they kind of get what the Navy would prefer them to have. So I don't have a good answer for you, mostly because I don't want to be in the middle of that fight. But I think technology, their perception of what technology is going to be important and what type of people and force structures are needed in order to use those technologies was a huge driving influence in why they made that big decision about changes in the force structure of the Marines.
Okay, we have a question over here, and those of you on Zoom, feel free to raise your hand.
A lot of these questions have been about the future and policy implications and stuff. I'm at the moment more curious about the origins of particularly the thoughts around force protection and casualty aversion. You say that this emerged, or at least in the chapter outlines that I can see in the book, it emerged in Vietnam. I did a Command F search just now in the Oxford academic version, and I was looking for names like Burnett and Powers and U2 and the phrase behind enemy lines. I'm wondering if you and McDonald thought about approaching it from that aspect.
So Howard is in there a little bit. We don't.
Okay.
It's really and only the discussion about like the strategic command after losing the U-2 was not as keen to fly manned missions over Soviet contested territory, and so space was seen as a really nice kind of unmanned alternative to that. They experimented actually with some unmanned strategic aircraft for reconnaissance, and actually used them against the Chinese, but did not often, that was not a primary investment for them against the USSR. Another one that actually really matters in terms of force protection is, and now the name's, I'm losing his name, the pilot that was the F-117 pilot that was shot down in Bosnia.
We were just talking about
Burnett, that was Chris
That was-
Burnett.
Oh, okay. That was a huge influence, especially on John Jumper. And Jumper ended up being the chief of staff of the Air Force when they decided to arm the Predator. So, and I've got quotes in the book about how important that particular moment was for him in making decisions about investment in unmanned aerial systems for the Air Force in the early 2000s. So there's a direct correlation between that event and later investments. I think there is a good question about how much of this is related to Vietnam and our lessons learned from Vietnam, and how much is just like the American way of war that we would prefer to fight. And I don't know. I mean, I think there is, I think that idea of an American way of war where we don't lose a lot of Americans, it's hard for me to know how contemporary versus long held.
There's some
it is.
research suggesting that goes pretty far back.
Like, there's a book by Steph Carbon that looks into some of this that was really compelling. We cited it in the book. And I would say that our argument about force protection is not that this is separate from that fundamental belief that the American way of war is to use technology to substitute for human loss of life, but instead that this is a refinement, a contemporary refinement of a predilection that we have had about war for a very long time. And that the experience in Vietnam anchors the belief in a relatively recent conflict in a way that that makes it, a somewhat more contemporary idea. But I do think there is these fundamental kind of undercurrents about U.S. wanting to use technology as a substitute for putting our people in harm's way.
Yeah, there's a quote by one of the directors of Central Intelligence. I can't remember how it goes, and I can't remember who it was. I think it was Dick Helms. But I mean, it could have even been a historian like Sherman Kent. But they said something along the lines of SIGINT will never be as good as human because it can never decipher the way that a human analyst can. Because you can collect information, but you'll never be able to understand it fully from a human perspective. And I think about that quote and I think about applying it in this aspect of Unmanned.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a constant question. It's like, how much is the human, I mean, we kind of went back and forth with Oxford on the front of the book. I wanted so much there to be this human element, the hand in the cover, because I wanted to show that this was not a book about a predator or a drone, but instead was a book about, what was actually the marionette, who was the puppet master. So.
Other questions? Let's take two over here. So we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, I was busy with work, so I joined late. And my name is Ali. I'm at the NPTS department, NPTS program. So this idea of using technology in war dates back centuries, right? Technologies have changed in kinds and types, but technology has always been a device of war. When Obama took over as the president of the United States, there was a great emphasis, especially in Afghanistan, on having a light footprint strategy. So a lot of drone warfare took center stage from 2006 onwards. And my country, Pakistan, bore the brunt of that. And it led to great anti-Americanism, and it led to the flaring up of militancy and terrorism in that region, which was already in the grips of terrorism. One of the things that I noticed as that time I was a citizen, and then when I looked at these issues as a watcher and as someone who writes on these issues, I was struck by the fact that the American way of fighting wars has always been heavy-handed. And the induction of technology in those scheme of things, has not taken into account the peculiar battlefield dynamics of those regions. Like General McChrystal had a different approach in Iraq, and he used the same approach in Afghanistan without understanding that the two battlefields were so different to each other. Afghanistan has a different landscape, Iraq has a different landscape. So in your research and in your other studies, how have you looked at this battle appreciation abilities of the U.S. Army when it comes to mixing technology with boots on ground?
Okay. Should we get one more?
Sure.
Okay. Go ahead, please.
Sure. Max Patterson, studying MPTS here. I'm curious about sort of how, these ideas diffuse through the services, like horizontally and vertically. You said that, I think at the very beginning, we were talking about how Marines preferred, manned CAS or manned strikes, but thought, unmanned is inevitable. How did they get that message? Where did they pick up that idea from within their service?
Oh, those are both like two really hard questions. So you had both a pretty theoretical and a very concrete question here. I'm gonna take your concrete question and deal with the use of drones and unmanned in Pakistan, and to some extent Afghanistan. We actually got to interview Leon Panetta for the book, and he's also in the podcast. So we talked a little bit about his decisions about the use of unmanned systems.
He was the man back in the day.
Yeah. And still, a great neighbor in our community.
Yes, of course.
So it's always hard for me to completely, with these type of questions, think about, is it about us doing strikes in Pakistan, or is it about it being unmanned? There were actually a lot of manned strikes that started occurring as we were further into the conflict. There are examples actually of manned aircraft that we know were in Pakistan airspace. I think what unmanned did, though, was it allowed the Obama administration to be able to operate in Pakistan without being worried that they were going to have to pick up a pilot in Pakistan. Would they have done the same missions with manned aircraft? I think a lot of them, yes. But I think less. I think the stakes would have had to be higher before they did them. And there's a level of the manned aircraft that have the same persistence as those particular unmanned aircraft also are highly vulnerable to being shot down. So it is more risky. I think they still would have thought it was worth the risk to use manned aircraft. And actually, manned aircraft accompanied the strikes on bin Laden. So I think some of those would have still occurred, but probably not to the intensity and not the amount, right? The US did pay a lot of attention to collateral damage. They probably did more strikes because they had unmanned, but they also used that system as a way to, they used the Hellfire, which has a really, really small radius of destruction. And so I can't answer the question, and it's beyond my research about whether the fact that they use unmanned made them more unpopular with the Pakistani tribal regions or in Afghanistan. I don't know the answer to that. And I think there probably are, if they had been manned, would that have been better? I don't know.
No, that would have been worse because there were two strikes. One was the Abtabad operation and the other was at Salalah on 26 November 2011. And that created a diplomatic row between the two countries, and the US had to almost apologize to Pakistan.
Yeah. So I don't have a good answer here, but I'm not sure it's just about unmanned versus manned. I think it's the decision to, it was the, use of long range strikes, no matter whether it was a manned or unmanned platform. Diffusions of ideas through the service. This is my favorite part of the book, is following the diffusion of these ideas. And the force protection and the role of Vietnam is really interesting because the way it diffuses is in this really organic way. So people come, young officers come back from Vietnam, and they populate, TRADOC and the organizations that are training the next generation of officers, and then they become the leaders of organizations that are building the campaigns and so you have this. You don't have to. That idea does not have to be written about. You don't see that many you don't see like books about like how important casualty aversion. In fact, you see books about like why the data does not support casualty aversion. But it's just ingrained. Like it doesn't have to be taught, we just know it, right? Whereas the ideas about technology and military revolutions is not organic, right? So that has to be taught. It has to be taught in war games. It has to be taught in PME curriculum. And the use of academia, like the funding the military revolutions research, for example, and then using the PME curriculum, putting those in the PME curriculum, that's a really interesting way. And then I guess the other way those ideas diffuse is the network of idea entrepreneurs. So you have, Andy Marshall, but then you have all the people who have worked for him, and then you have all the people who have worked for them. And so Andy Marshall did a really good job of finding talent that wasn't necessarily the 4-star general or the 3-star general. That was short-term influence. It was building the majors, the colonels, the civilians that were going to be there for 20 years. And a lot of the people that were really young working for Andy Marshall went on to become the Secretary of the Air Force, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. You can trace, and so it's really interesting. The ideas, if you look at Third Offset with Bob Work is an Andy Marshall acolyte, right? And a lot of his ideas are influenced by the time he spent with Andy Marshall and the ideas about revolution military affairs. So two really different examples of the way in which these ideas propagate. And then, I think it's always interesting to download the curriculum, the service curriculum from the different professional military institutions. So when you go to the Naval War College, you're going to read Mahan and, these thinkers about naval war. And when you go to the Air Force, you're going to read stuff about strategic air power. And I actually got to interview John Warden for the book. That these are big, important people. So looking at their different curriculums, you can see how entrenched the services are about who they think they are, and that which books show up year after year after year on this curriculum as a way of enforcing it. I mean, in many ways, for me, working on this book, I was like, oh my gosh, this thing that I had been ingrained in me about the Air Force, oh, that's where that came from. It's just kind of interesting. So.
I think just two-finger briefly on the casualty aversion thing. My sense is there was a lot of thinking and some studies after Vietnam about, how did we, lose the war?
Yeah.
And I think inside the military, the predominant narrative that came out is that the military didn't lose the war. It was lost on the home front.
Yes.
So it kind of comes in the back door that way, like, why did we lose on the home front? Oh, it was on television. The public wasn't ready to see the footage. There were too many casualties.
Right.
Now we're gonna have military press pools. We're gonna fight in ways that reduce casualties.
So they had a RAND study that comes out in the late 70s, and that becomes the thing, because the RAND study validates that. But then 10 years later, it's Peter Fever and all these others, and it doesn't invalidate it. It's like, yes, but that yes, but never showed up.
Yeah.
It's just, I remember taking lessons on the CNN effect. So, I think you're exactly right.
Other questions?
This might be sort of out of the scope of the book, and it's sort of related to some of the questions that were already discussed. But to what extent do you see the changes or the discussions on emerging technologies as well as unmanned systems to what extent are they being incorporated elsewhere in the world? What's the sort of the learning experience?
Yeah.
Do they want to emulate?
Yeah. Well, I felt like there was a lot of emulation that was occurring during counterinsurgency, where there was like a perception that you needed something like the Predator or the Reaper, because that's what the U.S. was flying, and pretty successfully in the conflict that they were in. And you did see some countries emulating that. But I think if you look at the amount of investment that countries like China and Iran did in conventional missile capabilities, that is not an emulation of the United States, right? Like that's going off your own strategy. And then watching kind of who is adopting or adapting from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I mean, in many ways, I feel like the U.S. has kind of lost its position as the ideational leader in what the future of war is. I think a lot of countries are looking at the U.S. and they're like, what can we buy from you besides big platforms, you know? So, and I mean, we see that, right? There's a diversification of who's providing arms out in the international market. And it is not necessarily dominated by US arms. Even our allies, I mean, does Taiwan need a bunch of F-16s or F-35s, or could they use like a shit ton of naval mines and or demining capability?
Any final questions? Okay, well, this has been fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.